Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy that I made it here. And it's a pleasure to share the panel with Gregor. Before I start, I would just want to focus on this disclaimer to say that everything I'm saying are my own views, so they don't represent the European Commission. So, I don't want to raise your expectations. I'm not going to give an official EU position to the question that Greg left open at the end of his talk. But my aim is more humble. But I would like to get you through an analysis of rebates we did in a case a few years ago. I will set a few general principles, and then we open the floor for discussion. So this is a bit the outline of my talk. A very short introduction about the guidelines, the effects-based approach in the revised guidelines of 2009, and then we will go to exclusive dealing, which is the topic of this session, and more particularly in conditional rebates. So as I said, I will lead you through the Velux case, which we did a few years ago. There is no decision because it was an ex officio case opened by the Commission, and there was no official complaint. Since we closed the case, we didn't have to release any decision, so the only thing publicly out there is a paper I wrote with a colleague of mine. This is not to advertise, but it's just for some formal steps are set there. I will not get into the details of the Intel case. There is a decision there. Greg already advanced a bit the theories, but you have them on the slides. So then you will have the slides. If there are any questions, we can use the slides as a background. Then I will finish it with a few reflections after the Intel judgment. So yes, this is the article 102. I put it as a background if we need to go back. As I said, so as you know, in 2009, there was an important revision of the guidelines on the enforcement of exclusionary conduct, and then the effects-based approach was put forward. The main features of the analysis based on effects was that the Commission committed to investigate the effect of the practice, not only the form, and then to prove the anti-competitive foreclosure by developing a theory of harm, not only observing foreclosure, but also showing the incentives, the ability, and the consumer harm. The main elements of this effects-based approach is that we were looking at the consumer welfare, how to enhance this consumer welfare by protecting competition. Then the use of as efficient competitor test, I will develop quite a lot in my presentation, this test, because it was used both in Velux as in Intel. And then, this revision also opened up the floor for an efficiency defense, the possibility of the type 101 type defense for dominant firms. If they put forward some efficiency justifications, the Commission should take them into account. So these are the important elements, the new elements in the revision of 2009, which is not that new anymore. So maybe the Intel judgment will trigger further, we know. Okay, after the publication of these new guidelines, there was this post-Denmark. It was not a judgment, it was a preliminary ruling by the court on reviewing the Commission. So on a preliminary ruling on a question referred to by a national court. And this is the first time where the court acknowledged that the effects-based approach was legitimate, was interesting, was useful. The case was, maybe you're familiar, in Denmark, the incumbent monopolist was discriminating in favor of competitors' customers. The competitors complained about this. And then the court looked at the role of the as efficient competitor test. So they were looking at the level of the pricing that the incumbent was setting, and they were comparing this level with the average incremental cost, average total cost. These are some measures of cost that the Commission developed in the guidelines. I will talk a bit about later, but it's just, let's say, a measure of costs. So as long as the pricing of the incumbent was not below that measure of cost, then there shouldn't be any problem. Even if the competitors are excluded, they are excluded because they are not as efficient as the incumbent, so then this shouldn't be a problem. So they found that there were no concerns. The incumbent was found okay to price discriminate in favor of, so cherry pick the customers of the competitors to offer good prices in order to attract. This was a pro-competitive practice because prices were lower. They were not lower than a measure of cost that an as efficient competitor would also have. So this was a good news for the Commission as regards the effects-based approach, and we shouldn't, Gregor didn't mention it, but we shouldn't forget about this. Okay, this was before Intel, but it's still there. Okay, this is just an enumeration. Apart from the exclusive dealing, the new guidelines were dealing with other specific forms of abuse, the tying and bundling, which was the Microsoft case, predation, a very old AXO case, and refusal to supply and margin squeeze. We had in quite a few cases, lots of telecom cases. The Commission, Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, Telesonera, Slovak Telekom. I'm not going to get into the details of the margin squeeze, but this is a category of abuse that we had quite a few cases. Okay, now back, focusing on our topic. What is the question in the exclusive dealing issue? May a dominant firm use these exclusive contracts to damage actual and potential competitors? There was a controversial history in the antitrust context regarding this. I will just have one slide. So we are back in the 70s. Gregor already mentioned the Chicago school that was defending the efficiency effects of the contracts. They were saying that the buyer would not sign a contract if he or she wouldn't have any benefits from it. Nobody could oblige a buyer to send a contract against their wish or their way of being profitable, getting some profits from this contract. If you bear with me just 1 minute, this is the most technical slide I have with this graph. I want to show you that if there are no other justifications, and there are in practice because Gregor enumerated at least 3 of them, if there are no other, in a simple theoretical case, it's impossible. A monopolist cannot compensate a buyer for sticking with them if there is a more efficient entrant that would enter the market. So the thing is, if we have a monopolist, so this is the monopoly price, and this C is the consumer surplus. So that's what the consumers get in a monopoly, whatever is above the monopoly price. So this is the consumer surplus, and this is the cost of the monopolist. So A plus B is the monopoly profits. The monopolist has these profits, the consumers have C. Now let's assume that there is a more efficient entrant that has these costs lower than the monopolist. The entrant enters the market and prices below the cost of the monopolist. So the incumbent, in order for the incumbent to keep the buyer with them, they would need to offer, so in this case, if consumers would move to buy from the entrant, they will get C plus A plus B, because the entrant prices here just slightly below the cost of the monopoly. They price, because they are more efficient, they have lower costs, so they can price slightly below here. So the consumer will get all this C plus A plus B, all this surplus. So the consumer will get the surplus C plus A plus B, but the monopolist has the profits only A plus B. So it's impossible for the monopolist to compensate the consumers to stick to them, unless there are efficiency justification. I don't know if I hope I was clear. I convinced in this simple theoretical model where there are no efficiencies here incorporated. In order for the incumbent to compensate the buyer to stick with them, they would have to pay this C plus A plus B, which they would get, the surplus they will get from buying from the entrant. And they practically cannot pay this because their profit, the profit of the monopolist, is only A plus B. So if there are no, I'm repeating myself, but I think this is a very important concept to understand. If there are no other efficiency justification, a monopolist wouldn't be able to compensate. Now, the theory after Chicago says, and there are models about this, that actually in practice, there are situations when the monopolist could compensate the buyer. And for example, one of these circumstances, the paper was already mentioned by Gregor, is when these buyers, there are many buyers and they cannot coordinate. So one single buyer is not able, doesn't have a sufficient scale to trigger entry, to give incentives or sufficient scale to an entrant to make its entry profitable. So in the case when the buyers cannot coordinate, then the incumbent can take advantage, can propose these contracts, and can compensate them. Okay, now I'm moving a bit to what the guidance is saying on exclusive dealing, and yes. So the paragraph 32 sets the two types of exclusive dealings that are more often encountered in practice. These are exclusive purchasing obligations with an unavoidable trading partner and rebates. And yeah, the guidance say that dominant undertaking may try to foreclose its competitors. So it's no presumption of harm. They may try through these two types of contracts. Now also the guidance, I'm coming back to this because this is very important in the analysis we made, mentioned in paragraph 23, the role of the as efficient competitor test. So we are concerned about the exclusion of the competitors as long as these competitors are as efficient as the incumbent. So the Commission will normally intervene where this conduct may hamper competition from competitors which are considered to be as efficient as the dominant undertaking. There was a TOMRA judgment in 2008 where the court upheld the decision of the Commission, where the court was receptive to the analysis effect, even if there was no as efficient competitor test. But still, this is another piece in the jurisprudence that we make reference to where some acknowledgement of the use of effects was made. Okay, now I will show you, this is the second graph. I promise there's only one, but this is a simple graph to show you when the rebates, some exclusionary rebates may be anti-competitive or when they may not be competitive. How do we measure this? Okay, let's say there is an incumbent, let's say the list price is set at 50, and then there is an incumbent that would give a retroactive discount to the buyer of 10 euros per unit, so they would lower the price to 40 euros under the condition that the buyer buys all the units from them. So if they buy 100% of demand, let's say 100 units, they get a discounted price of 40 for all these units. So the discount would be 50 minus 40 is 10 euros per unit, so 1,000 euros, the whole discount from this incumbent. Now, if a potential entrant or a potential competitor would be willing and able to compete on, let's say, 40% of the share, which we already, Gregor introduced the concept of contestable share of the demand, so 40% of the buyers would be willing to buy from a competitor. A competitor could contest 40% of the market share of the incumbent. Then, how, this is, I have to, what would be the effective price this competitor should set in order to compensate the buyer for losing the retroactive rebate? So remember, I said there were 1,000 euros, the amount of the rebates. If the competitor can compete for 40 euros, then the discount for one unit should be 25, right? 1,000 divided by 40, they should give 25 euros per unit in order to equalize the whole discount that the buyer may receive from the incumbent, right? So they should set the effective price to 25 euros. If they set the effective price of 25 euros, a buyer from that contestable share should be indifferent between losing the retroactive rebate and buying from the incumbent at the list price, and the situation where they buying 60 units from the incumbent and the rest of the 40 from the entrant. This is one situation. They should be indifferent between this situation and receiving the retroactive discount for all the units from the incumbent. Now, the decision of whether this type, so this rebate of 10 euros is exclusionary, it all depends on what? On the cost, on the measure of cost that these companies have, as efficient competitor has, or the incumbent has. I mean, in this extreme case, it's hard. In very few industries, you would have a margin of 50%. It's not easy to implement a price which is half the price offered by the monopolist. So in this particular case, it's more likely that the cost, I call it here, I already introduced the terminology used in the guidelines, long run average incremental cost, so the cost that is incurred by producing the extra 40 units, let's say incremental cost, or average avoidable cost. So it's a terminology used in the guidelines, so let's say a measure of cost. The way I put it there, this cost is, so the effective price that the entrant needs to set in order to compensate the buyer is below this measure of cost. So in this case, the discount, the rebates set by the incumbent are exclusionary. They would exclude the competitor because the competitor is not able to mimic this because simply the price would be below this measure of costs. If this cost would be below 25 euros, then an as efficient competitor having the same cost would be able, because the price of 25 euros is higher than the cost. I don't know, I hope it was useful. I found this an interesting illustration of how and when discounts are retroactive and how much the incumbent should set the price at which level in order to compensate the buyer for losing the retroactive rebate. So that's a bit the thing we did in the Velux case. Okay, so I'll get you through the steps of the Velux case now. As I said, there is no decision, and of course the numbers I'm using are not real numbers. This is just an example, but it reflects the analysis we did in this case. It was in 2009. Okay, so the only public thing is a press release from Financial Times. Velux had, there was no complaint, official complaint, but there was a competitor that claimed that Velux, through their practices, especially through their rebates, were excluding them from the market. This was a Polish window manufacturer saying that the Danish rival uses rebates and other commercial tactics to stop retailer selling its product. So they say they couldn't build a viable distribution system in some European markets. But all this extra official, so we didn't have an official complaint. Just to advance you a bit the conclusions, we made the analysis, and what we concluded that these claims were not, these claims of FACRO were either not substantiated, or if they were true, this was not because of the exclusionary effect of the rebates, but rather because of the inefficiency of FACRO. So Velux, maybe you know, they are producing roof windows. It's a very simple product. So that was our market. Customers were distributors, so not really final customers. So that's why customers, so in any investigation, usually in mergers, we ask customers and competitors. In mergers, we find a lot of interesting feedback from customers, and they are the ones who would complain if the merger is anti-competitive. But here, final customers were not feeling the difference in the price of the roof windows, because a roof window, in the price of a roof window in the price of a house was a very tiny proportion. So they were not very small percentage of in the final price. So it was not noticeable that whether prices of the roof windows were moving a lot. So from customers we couldn't. And the architects and the distributors, they also didn't have incentives to find the cheapest ones, because also Velux had a reputation, and because they knew that the impact on the price and the total price of the house was not so relevant. Now, that we investigated two practices in Velux. One was the rebates. We were asking whether Velux could give disincentives to distributors to switch. We had Velux discount schemes from all countries. They were following similar principles. We also used the documents, and we also went on inspections to Velux premises and to Velux distributors. The second practice that complainants mentioned was sort of a predation story, because Velux launched a second brand. It was called Rooflight. I think today it's called something else, because they wanted to enter in the low end of the market, because Velux was a high end of the market. They have such a high reputation that their name became generic. So they wanted to enter the low end of the market with this brand. And because the competitors were somewhere in between, they were also feeling squeezed from the low end of the market, and they claimed the theory of harm, in this case put forward by the competitors, was that Velux was cross-subsidizing somehow, and they were actually incurring losses with this secondary brand in order to exclude competitors also from the low end of the market. We also looked in the internal documents for Velux. We were trying to understand the strategy behind the launch of the secondary brands, and we also looked at data concerning their profitability. Now I'm going back to rebates. This was maybe 90% of our analysis, because the other theory was from the beginning not confirmed. The paragraph 37 talks about the conditional rebates. The two types of conditional rebates are mentioned there. I will show you in a graph the difference between retroactive and incremental rebates. And very importantly, they put forward here the efficiency role of rebates, because rebates lower prices, which is good for consumers. So they do explicitly mention that rebates may stimulate demand and benefit consumers. However, they can foreclose. They may have foreclosure effects on competitors, and then negative effects on competition. Now, conditional rebates are rebates. This is a very simplistic representation of these conditional rebates, where this is a volume. Rebates conditioned on the volume you buy or on the turnover you reach with a certain buyer. In the case of Velux, I think it was turnover. They were saying, let's say, if you have less than 100, whatever you want, units or euros or hundreds of euros, thousands. So if you have less than 100, you get no discount. If you have between 100 and 200, you get 0.5% discount, and so on. If you have the maximum step in the discount function was, let's say, 5%, or is in the example I'm putting it 5%. So if you buy more than 1,000 units, you get 5%, and this is the maximum. Now the important difference between incremental rebates and retroactive rebates, it's in this picture, where the blue area represents the amount of the rebates. So what is an incremental rebate? An incremental rebate is set in the following way. If the turnover is above a certain threshold, the discount increases marginally, and the higher discount is applied only to the part of turnover exceeding the previous step. So let's say here you buy, I don't know, you are somewhere in the middle here. So for the first 100 units, you will get this small discount. For the second 100 units, you will get a higher discount. For the third batch of 100 units, you will get a higher, and so on. So you will have the discount is applied only to the amount that exceeds the previous step. And this blue thing is the area of the total discount you get. Now if we go to the retroactive rebates means that the discount corresponding to a certain amount is applied to all the units bought up to that amount. So as you can easily see from the picture, it's much, much, much higher, the retroactive rebate. Now, the guidance paper already has a presumption that in general, retroactive rebates may foreclose the market more significantly, because as you could see from the graph, they are simply higher. I'm giving here a very, very simple example of how the incentives given by these retroactive rebates. For example, if you get 10% rebate on total purchases, if you buy more than 100 units and you get nothing for the first 100 units, then when you as a buyer want to decide for the unit 101 whether to stick to the incumbent or switch to a competitor, you will, knowing that this has a retroactive effect, if I buy one unit more, I will get the discount for all the units that I bought before, you will rather stick to the incumbent. So it has really a loyalty-inducing effect. These retroactive rebates may have a very high loyalty-inducing effect. Other features of the rebates described in the guidelines are in paragraph 39, actually not feature of the rebates, but factors that we should take into account when analyzing rebates. Paragraph 39 explains or makes a difference between non-contestable and contestable share of the demand. So which is the share of the demand that would switch to some competitors. The next paragraphs describe how to estimate the effective price, what I showed you in the previous graph of the 25 euros. How would you estimate the effective price a competitor would need to set in order to be able to compensate for the loss of the retroactive rebates? Then it also mentioned the relevant range. In the example I said 40%. What is the relevant range of demand that would switch? So when we make an analysis, what do we take into account? Because we don't go unit by unit, so even if in my illustrative examples I said so. One proxy we have for that is the market shares of the competitors. You would say that up to that level, competitors would switch. And then it introduces, the guidance introduces these two measures of costs, long-run average incremental cost or average avoidable costs, that are measures of costs that should be taken into account when you compare this effective price. It's not easy in practice to calculate these costs. I would say it's almost impossible to get a perfect measure of this long-run average incremental cost. But I mean, this is just an indication, and we should, I mean, try the best efforts to reach a reasonable conclusion on this. So if cases are borderlines, we didn't have this case in Velux, then we should take into account also other factors, because that is not really a precise way to compute this theoretical concept. And then the paragraph 45 makes a difference between individualized and standardized rebates. So rebates are, if they are targeted to a certain customer, or if they are standardized, they are universal, applied to all the market. They have less potential to be loyalty-inducing. Now, I will give you an example of incremental rebates and then an example of retroactive rebates. Velux schemes used to be incremental, then they were very much aware of competition, possible competition complaints, so they started to implement, I said they were using retroactive rebates, they started to implement incremental rebates, so we had to analyze a bit of everything, because we had all the countries most of the countries in Europe, except for Poland, which is the country of the complainant, Fakro, Velux was dominant. So I give here again an example to show you how we dealt with this. So let's say again, I'm coming back to the same figure. Let's say there are 10 steps. This is the rebate function of 0.5. So it goes up in steps, in small steps of 0.5%. And this is the maximum rebate, 5%. If you exceed 1,000 units, you get 5%. And the list price is 100. Now, for the lowest unit per unit here, effective price would be 95, because if you get the maximum discount of 5 euros out of 100, so you are left with 95. This 95 euros seems very likely to cover the costs of Velux. Luckily, in this case, discounts were so little and steps were so numerous that we had attempts to look into Velux costs, but having an idea about the margins in these industries, which were by far higher than 5%, we would say that the costs are as efficient competitor would be able to cover its costs with a price of 95. So they, by offering a price of 95, most likely that in such an industry, any competitor as efficient as incumbent may cover its costs. Okay, that's what I said. So it did seem unlikely that this type of rebates, being incremental and having so small step and being so low at the maximum level, all these characteristics made it very, very unlikely to be exclusionary. So we didn't find any anti-competitive foreclosure effect in this case. Now, what happens in the same case if the rebates are retroactive? The scheme is exactly the same, but the rebates are retroactive. So if you're somewhere here, you get this discount applied to all units bought up to that level. So in this case, the price, let's say the price for 100 units is, for 100 windows is, okay, for 99 windows, you don't get discount, right? Up to 99, you pay the full price. Now, if you buy 100, you will get a discount of 5% of all these 100. So this is 5 euros, right? Sorry, 50 euros. No. Okay, this is the list price. This is the number of units you pay. 0.5% of 100 by 100 is 50. Yes? No? Does it make sense? So the price for 100 windows is 99.50, right? Because you get this discount on all 100 windows, but then the price is 100. So that's the price you get for 100 windows. So, sorry?
You buy more and you pay less.
Yes. No, you pay more because it's 50 euros more.
It's 40 euros less. It's 50 euros less.
No, it's more.
It's more.
50 euros more, it means that the marginal price, what I call the marginal price for the window number 100 is 50. So this is the price for the last unit. This is the marginal price, because if you buy 99, you pay this. If you buy 100, you pay this. So the price, the marginal price of buying one extra unit is only 50 euros. So this 50 euros is already low. It's actually, like in my example, half of the list price. Now, but this is a very illustrative example, and we use units, so I'll say in the next slide we should use ranges. But this already shows that the marginal price may even become negative, as you said. I didn't construct the example in this way, but it may become negative, so you buy more and you pay less, as you said. So in this example, now I'm going to be a bit more realistic, saying that it's not the marginal price for one unit in reality, but you should look at the relevant range, what we described before. And I'm not going to go again in the details of this example for the relevant range, but I assumed here that the relevant range was 100 units, like one step. So in this case, the effective average price for this 100 units was something like 90 euros. This reflects a bit the Velux, it's not the figures from there. But in Velux, we saw that even if the rebates were retroactive, because the steps were so small and the level of rebates was not very high, even if the rebates were retroactive, the lowest average price for this relevant range was more than able to cover the costs. Because again, we looked at the margins in the industries without computing accurately the cost of Velux and looking at this. But a rough idea about the margins, if margins in the industry are 20% or 20, then you would say that a price of 90 is can be easily offered by the competitor. So we also found no anti-competitive foreclosure here, although you see that the prices the competitor should counter-offer, are much lower than in the case of the incremental rebates. Okay, so these are the conclusions, that we didn't find anti-competitive foreclosure, and these are the main reasons. The rebates were not individualized, they were incremental in most of the cases, or recently in all cases. there were many steps, and the maximum rebate was relatively small, and then the price for the relevant range was most likely higher than the measure of costs. For predation, we also, of this secondary brand, we also found no evidence of exclusion. Actually, we realized that Velux entered this low cost of the market in order to respond from competition in the low end of the market coming from Chinese manufacturers. So that's why they're bidding aggressively to get sales of this in this low end of the market. It was a perfect commercial strategy, so we didn't find, and there was no sacrifice, we didn't find any proof of predation. Okay, so we closed the case without a decision, and so I mentioned here just this little paper we wrote, a few pages about what I showed you in the slides. Now, I'm not going to talk about Intel. There are a few slides about Intel. We skipped them because you have the decision and we don't have time, but I'm happy to continue discussions about Intel if you prefer. As you know, in Intel, one of the theories of harm was also exclusionary rebates, and there the Commission did the as efficient competitor test, and in the case of Intel, it was not met. So the Commission said in the decision that the as efficient competitor test is not met. Okay, so we go to the conclusion, and I would like to say just a few words about the Intel judgment. Okay, so the conclusion before going to the judgment, that the theory of harm put forward by the Commission in the case of Intel was credible, and there was also there was a consistent set of circumstantial factors. So this is important to know. I mean, in all cases, I will say it also in the conclusion, the Commission is not basing its decision on only one element, be it quantitative or be it qualitative. Any decision is based on a set of circumstantial factors that should complement each other and should go in the same direction. It's also true that if we have a set of elements, a set of pieces of evidence, it's possible that one or two go in the opposite direction. That's why sometimes it's very difficult for us to balance. But I have I didn't put it here, a quote from the Ryanair judgment where the court acknowledges and says that the fact that the Commission is balancing pieces of evidence, and the fact that one piece of evidence goes against the conclusion of the Commission doesn't say that the Commission didn't take it into account. They did take it into account, but we did the weighing and we concluded in this way. So here in the Intel judgment, it was not only there are a few slides about many mentions in the decision about quotes found in the inspection about the exclusionary intentions of Intel and all this. Then the Commission, here I think they did request costs, and they had a much more thorough analysis of the as efficient competitor test, and it also failed. So there were many pieces of evidence that were leading to the conclusion that Intel's behavior was an abuse. And finally, there was lack of objective justification. Maybe it was in the previous slide, that Intel has not shown, because the guidance, as I said at the beginning, they leave room for objective justification of efficiencies. If the incumbent shows that this conduct is not is impossible, or these rebates are impossible to be offered without, there are some efficiencies in behind this conduct, then the Commission takes this into account, but the Intel didn't put forward these efficiencies in this case. So, on top of all the anti-competitive effects found by the Commission, Intel didn't come with objective justification, so the Commission fined Intel, and then the judgment, the court upheld Commission's decision. This decision was a test, as Gregor mentioned, for the effects-based approach. The court said that the as efficient competitor test was irrelevant. That was no need for economic analysis, because by object, these exclusivity rebates of this dominant firm that has, exactly as Gregor put it, a big part of contestable demand, they are, by their nature, exclusivity rebates, by their nature, are bad. So that's what the court left us with. Also, a good thing for us economists that the court did mention that an objective justification is legitimate, but yeah, unfortunately, for the test or for the community, Intel did not brought it forward, and that's why we don't have a standard at the moment that is backed up by the court. The guidance says that also that, the guidance says that it's the incumbent who has to come forward with these efficiencies, and they did it in this case, so we are a bit left without a standard. And then some personal reflections from discussions with other economists that, as I said, this debate, Intel decision, Intel judgment, economists, is very much focused on the price-cost tests. But as I said before, this is not the only element in one analysis we are doing in any case. So there are many other factors that are relevant. The guidance mentions only some of them, but there are many other factors, qualitative and quantitative, that should be taken into account in the decision. So it's not only the price-cost tests. We should look at the rationale of the practice, the efficiencies, and then I will end with the same reflection as Gregor, that it's necessary to have a theory of harm and then to check that the facts of the case do fit with this theory, and then we should look at the effects of this on rivals and consumers. And this is a final quote. Our chief economist, my boss, our chief economist, I found it in saw it in one of his presentations, and I liked it. It's by Vickers, who says that the law, to say that the law on abuse should develop a stronger economic foundations is not to say that rules of law should be replaced by discretionary decisions. So it's not law versus discretion. It's just that the law should be grounded in economics. It's not we have rules versus discretions. It's just that rules make sense. So it's good that we have rules for predictability, for transparency. Companies need to know how we deal with this, what are our principles, but they should be grounded in economics as much as possible. Okay. Thank you.